So hi, everybody. Welcome. This is Steve Cady with All Things Change at Bowling Green State University. And we are with our final in the series on the power of collaboration. And one of the things that I'm super grateful for is I sent out a little note to everybody in a part of my class I teach on collaborative change and innovation. And I just said, hey, who would be willing to come and speak to the class? And like within 24 hours, I had like 25, 30 something people send me a note and say, hey, I'll be there. And then I was like, okay, so how do I manage that? And I don't ever want to say no to somebody who's willing to talk with our students. I'm like, okay, so let's go back to the design board. And what we did is we basically scheduled out 5 sessions and set them up so that it could be a just-in-time conference, if you will. And we created Lisa is our producer and director, and she's working on our community engagement for Nexus. Nathan created the All Things Change podcast webinar logo and kind of set up the series. And within like 48 hours, we had the whole thing organized, everybody set up, and boom, we sent everything out. And it was fantastic. So thank you all for that. Thank you for jumping in and being willing to share. People are better because of this work. I think there's a bubbling up right now. People are ready. There's kind of emerging back out and saying, we want more of this. We want to engage more. We want more of this conversation. So the intention is for us to continue to do more of that with the Collaborative Change Library. We got the 6-volume set. All of you know about that, or many of you know about that. We've got the book that's coming out, the print version called the Collaborative Change Handbook, which will have everything in it. And we're continuing to add, like we're finding all these methods. We continue to find techniques from around the world where people are doing really amazing work. And so my goal, my passion has always been is to create a space for us all to connect so we can advance this work and make it more present, make it more real, make it more of a significant part of how organizations and communities be together. And so that's my passion, and I'm sticking to it. And we have a great group here today. And Dave is going to kick us off. So thank you for being willing to kick us off. And what we're going to do today is we're going to have a little 10, 15 minutes. We're going to prime the pump, if you will. So I'll give you a little friendly reminder that you're at the 10-minute mark. And so you got about 5 more minutes. Right? So just however, don't feel like you have to fill it all up, just however you wish to share. And then what we'll do is we're going to go into breakout rooms. And what we'll do is we'll have an opportunity to talk about what we heard, what our reactions are, and what questions we have. And then we'll come back and we'll have 45 minutes of good conversation. What's really cool, what's emerged, is that our panel will stay on the main room. And they will have a conversation. We record that, so you're not missing out on their conversation. We keep that because it's very rich. You'll go to your breakout, have a nice conversation, then you'll pop back in, and then we'll open it up for a bigger conversation. So it's a lot of fun, and it's rich, it's personal, and it's real. So Dave, and is going to kick us off for us. And Dave, you want to start off, and then who's going next after Dave?
Emily.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm not going to do any transition. He'll finish, and then he'll just hand the baton off to you, and then you hand it off to
Al.
Great. And then there's Jim. Hey, yep. Jim.
Hey, Steve. How you doing?
Good to see you. So you get to round us out, clean up hitter, and
don't forget our other Jim.
2 Jims.
2 Jims. Don't forget other Jim.
Jim is 3rd, and then Jim Haudan is 4th. It says James there. My brother's name is James. So I call my brother James. So James, I'm going to call you James. So.
And don't forget Al. Al was coming after Dick and Emily. So.
Okay, right. So they all got.
So 5.
Here's the cool thing. Everybody knows what order they're going in. I'm out of the way. Just hand it off to the next person, and you go. We take 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll have time for a breakout discussion, and then we'll come back and have a full room discussion. So with no further ado, Dave, would you like to take her away for us?
Okay. Well, my name's actually Jim. No, I'm kidding. Well, I'm going to start out with the question, what is your favorite story on the power of collaboration? And that'll put us in context with why I'm here today. My favorite story of collaboration is that I have had the honor and privilege of knowing Peter Vale for a long while, and through to the point when he left us. And we began collaborating on his last goal, which was to have a book on practice, the nature of practice, something that mattered a great deal to him. And it does to me, and I think it does to all of us. So I'm going to try to put that in context today and why it's important. But the book is called Practice is a Way of Being, Peter Vale's Conjectures on Why Practice Matters. And I put a link in the, a shameless plug in the chat, because the publisher of the book is Steve Cady, and the team that's working with me, primarily Theo Ford-Stiegler, is terrific. And this is a digital book. So it's a digital first book, therefore it's one of the very few of its kind. And I think Peter would have loved that, because he believed that practice always should have an ing, practicing, changing, moving. Let me start with something that Peter used as his way of thinking to create this book before he couldn't any longer. Practice is the conscious ability fairly consistently to produce intended results. I'll pause there. Change, the kind of change we're talking about, is constituted by intended versus unintended results. So right away, the intentionality of a person in their own way to produce results is important. But Peter coined the phrase permanent white water a long while ago, where he said that change is changing, and it's going to become even more difficult for us to hold ourselves steady on a particular course of action, because change is always happening. So the continuing part of this definition of a way of thinking is to produce these results across a range of circumstances, and to do so while changing and growing oneself to meet the changing circumstances in which one's practice exists. Now, as a lifelong teacher, as far back as I could remember, I was teaching, and for 50 years taught management, organizational behavior, innovation, knowledge management, anything I could get my arms around to help students change and grow. But one of many reasons I've loved this way of thinking is that it's going to be what they do which will precipitate the change and growth. And so as they seek to produce ever increasingly challenging results ever more important to them foremost, and then with others with whom they collaborate, the payoff is always that they're going to change and grow. So while we're talking about all these ways of bringing people together to collaborate to produce organization change, recognize we're doing them a hell of a favor, because we're giving them a natural way to continue to develop themselves as persons and as practitioners. Now, we use the title enaction for my session, or my part of this panel. And that's a key word for the work that I've done with my son, David Jr., because we believe that practice itself is socially enacted. It means that it's behavior that occurs in the moment. While we can label it and give it certification and everything else, it's in the doing that practice occurs, at the point of action that practice matters the most. And therefore, the person who delivers that practice in that moment is attempting to make a change. Now, why collaboration? Because we know in all of the 32 conjectures that Peter developed and I have animated, I believe, in the way I've written the book, we know that very little can be done alone, because we're in a social system, a social technical system. And so most of the results we wish to achieve rely upon other people helping us, collaborating with us. And some of those results can only be done collectively. They have to be bigger payoffs for the organization than one person can deliver. So what is the practice that we think is deepest in the nature of practice itself? Conversation. Conversation is where two people or more take a moment, like we will as soon as I'll let someone else talk, that where we start seeing things the same way. And it's not always an immediate thing. We have to take some turns of talking. We have to listen, because what we're looking at in that conversation is an actual performance. It's something we're doing. And the purpose of that performance is to agree upon a course of action, even for the next minute, if not for the next month or year. So that's the closest look that I can see so far of how collaborative change actually happens. Two or more people intending to produce results that matter to both or all, talking with each other. Now, so many of the change practices and tools that I've been learning since I brought my career out of retirement and into this experience with my library have to do with that very moment where people are searching for a chance to get their heads together with others, but they want it to be effective. They need that conversational practice to work, because it's such a precious set of minutes. Most of it's done casually and informally, but when we bring people together formally, we want that to work. So I'm asking you to think of the practitioner as a power source, as a source of energy, that when we can harness them and give them a chance to talk well with each other and then see the results emerging, that we're going to have a lot more fun in our careers, because we'll know that no matter what else we've done, even if that change doesn't happen overnight, engaging people in that kind of collaborative work is how they're going to grow themselves as practitioners, whether they're teachers, doctors, chief cooks, or bottle washers. That effort to make things work better is how they grow themselves. And the key in the payoff here for Peter Vale, always, if he were here to say, it's about the learning. It's about the learning. So hope you find our book. I hope you find out where I am in the world. Let me ask you this. Have you heard the Practice podcast that I started with Peter Vale when he was too sick to continue to work on the manuscript with me? You'll hear 22 episodes with Peter Vale himself in conversation with me, talking just about the way we are right now, this way of thinking, the importance of practice to us who are theoreticians and those of us who deliver theory to the field, and those who learn from the field what theory we need to make next. So the Practice podcast, and practice is a way of being. Steve, have I done enough plugs here? Is there anything else? Thank you.
I think we're next. Am I correct?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
All right. All right. I'm Emily Axelrod,
I'm Dick.
and we're used to be the Axelrod group. We're now retired. You speak a minute.
Okay,
I
and,
drink.
Our work was in the idea of large scale collaborative change, and we created what was called the conference model, which essentially was just a series of large group sessions designed to bring people together to look at organizational change. So our latest thinking really, I want to follow the basics of what Dave was talking about, because these large group sessions created an arena where that could happen. And what we've been learning over the last couple of years with COVID and everything is that it really works well virtually. We would have sworn up and down you could not do this remotely. But it really, really works. And it essentially allows more people to participate in a way that they weren't able to participate before. What we've seen is that clients are including people where they might not have flown them in to be part of a process. We'll talk more about this as we go on, but for the last couple of years, we've been involved in a project with the US Census Bureau, and their ability to bring people together, virtually really changed the whole process and the way they were thinking. Also required us to rethink how we did things, because we found that in a sense, it was going back to square one and thinking about, well, if you're going to do this in a virtual environment, what are your core principles? How can the technology begin to enable people to work together as opposed to being an impediment to working together? And so all those things required us to essentially reinvent a process we had been doing for 20 years. You able to talk now?
Yes, I think so. One of the things that what I learned better as we did this virtually is we had people in small groups of about 5, and they connected, and you'd be sitting here just like we are now, and a cat would walk across the screen, or you'd hear a baby back in the room next door, or you'd hear the teenagers yelling as they went through the house.
Or being yelled at.
And one of the things that did for the folks that we worked with was to humanize the people that they worked with. And it really connected them in a way that was very different. Because they looked out there and they said, really, this makes these people human. I mean, we're like this. This is us. We all have things going on as we work at home that we would probably not want to have, but we have to. This is life. And that was a real interesting kind of learning for me in terms of that. And it created a greater connection among people. People had empathy for other people, and you could see that. And they were really kind to other folks.
And this is not new, but I think it's worth emphasizing. When we talk about large groups and bringing large groups of people together, the numbers is not the deal. Okay. It's not, can you have 500 people in the room? Or now, if it makes sense, that's okay. But the goal is not the numbers. The goal for us is really, can we bring a diverse group of people together who represent different viewpoints, different experiences? Can they have the experience of conversation that allows them to see things differently? And so, I think that's important to remember and not get lost in, it goes back to intentionality. It goes back to purpose. What are we really trying to create by bringing people together? And I'll just use that to switch to one of my favorite stories. And that was, we were working in Canada on drug addiction. And it was, how do you bring better services to addicts? And one of the, in the planning, they were saying, well, who needs to be here? And they wanted a judge. In Canada, they have drug courts. And so they wanted a judge to be part of there, along with the chief of police, along with the schools. When you start thinking of all the different stakeholders, and people said, well, you can't get a judge because they won't shut down the court. Well, someone said, well, let's ask her. Okay. And guess what? She shut down the court and for a day to be there. And at the end of the day, she said, what I learned today was that I've been sentencing people incorrectly. I thought I was trying to help them, but in a sense, I was sentencing them in a way that made their addictions worse. So that's one of my favorite stories. Had they not been in the room, okay, had they not connected around the topic, had they not had those conversations, that outcome would have never been there. So that's one of my favorite stories.
Yeah, one of my favorite stories is we were working with a bunch of nurses and management folks in a hospital setting, and they were trying to figure out how to better service children in their community. And this is another Canadian community. And so they were talking initially about building a children's hospital. And they kept going and going. And finally, somebody said, well, as they went, what's our real purpose in terms of this? And they dug into that more. And as they dug into that, what they figured out was that they could fit out a bus and take it around into the neighborhoods and do what they wanted to do rather than build a building, because it would reach more people. They were in a large area up in British Columbia. And that to me was really, it was wonderful to see how that conversation went from a permanent building where the people would have to come to a bus that they would take to the people. It was a really interesting conversation. But it goes back to the conversation you were talking about, Dave. I mean, they were sitting there and going at it, trying to sort it through and making these different connections.
So I'd like to talk about what are some of the principles that ground our work. Let's see if I can do this correctly. How about that? Okay. So we've identified four principles in our work. The first is you got to widen the circle involvement. That means including more people. And one of our favorite stories about that from the Census Bureau is it's wonderful to have a whole army of statisticians at your beck and call. So they figured out a way to make sure that all the different levels, all the different functions, all the different everybody was in the room. So they created this pretty sophisticated program to make sure everybody was included, which, because of the organization, gave the whole thing some face value, that they were really serious about including people. And then you get a bunch of people, but then you have to build a connection, and the connection comes through conversation. It comes through purpose. This work was going on during the census, and what you realized was that at the Census Bureau, they had a very high purpose that was built in, and the dedication to doing the census right and to making sure that it would be there was there. But what's interesting is that they weren't talking about the current census. They were talking about the census. We were talking about what the Census Bureau would be like for the 2030 census. And so everything was built around what the future would be like and how to take the values of the Census Bureau. And we built, we had to look at communities for action. So how do we build a community? Well, the purpose really helped, but the other thing that we did was we paid a lot of attention to making sure people understood the technology. We used a lot of different programs throughout the course of, we used Adobe Connect, we used Mural, we used a lot of different programs, but before every session, we had training sessions for everybody so that they could actually feel comfortable in the space, and that the technology wasn't getting in the way. It was becoming an enabler, and that we could be able to have conversations, which, one thing in community, a real community expresses different points of view. And so we did that. And then the last thing throughout was promoting fairness, making sure that everybody had a chance to speak, to participate, to be part of the process. And what we've learned through practice is that, if you do one of these principles, you'll get a benefit. If you take all four and put them together, you get a synergistic effect that really makes a difference. And then the other is the leadership practices that we thought made a difference. So the notion of honesty, leadership being honest and expecting honest for people, being transparent, being clear about what was doable, what was open for discussion, what wasn't. We've got all kinds of government laws that had to be obeyed in doing the work. And the fact that the leadership trusted the people to come up with the right answer. I mean, with COVID and everything, they had every excuse to stop this. but they said, no, the future really depended on collaboration. And they trusted that if they brought a diverse group of people together, they would come up with answers that would benefit the Bureau, benefit the country as a whole. So then just let me say one other piece here. Well, it's not. Hang on, it's not advancing the way I want.
I would say that all of this was going on in the Bureau at the same time that there was a lot of political upheaval around the census and what it was going to come out with. And that didn't come into the conversation at all. It was really good. They were able to keep boundaries.
Okay.
So,
Well, technology happens. The PowerPoint's not advancing, but we have a model called the Meeting Canoe, which we wrote about in the
5-6 years ago.
in the books that Steve's put out, and it really talks about things you need to do in a meeting. You got to make sure people feel welcome. You got to connect people to each other. You have to have a place where you discover what the future is about. Look at people's dreams, okay? A place for decision and attending to the end about how you close. And so those are the things that we apply whenever we're using these principles to work. But and just a last thing is that you know, the principles are great, the practices are great, but it's really it's the purpose and intentionality that you bring to them. Because the Mark Weisford used to have a favorite saying, and he'd say, well, the methods don't care how they're used. Okay. And so you know, we have all great methods, but if you don't have a purpose and a purpose that's worthy of the work, then it's really not going to mean anything. So I think with that, we'll call it our piece, bring our piece to a close.
Thank you. That was really good.
Yeah. So, Al, I think you're up.
I think, there you go.
How about
Okay.
now? Okay.
There you go.
Well, wow, it's tough following really smart people. But I'm going to try. I've also tried to follow the direction, although I didn't completely follow it. I'm going to share with you my responses to the talking points that Steve has proposed. So this is me, what you get after 25 years of doing this kind of work. Like to fashion myself as a co-author. Done a lot of work with nonprofits, a lot of work in education, particularly the last decade or so. In my early years, I spent time in auto plants and manufacturing facilities. But in all of this time, and Kathy Dannemiller being kind of the mentor that kind of guided this, and let me respond to the question of the core principles of collaborative work. And I think Steve will recognize these as being kind of central to the way he and Kathy talked about it. If you want collaborative work to work, you have to figure out a way to engage the whole system. You have to be really clear about purpose of why we are doing this. What is it going to look like if it's better? Kathy used to say, what would better look like? You have to notice that change is a journey, not a destination, not an event. And particularly if you're involved in large group interactive process, people sometimes think the event is the end when in fact it's just the beginning. Theory guides action. There's no, like Kurt Lewin said, there's nothing as practical as a good theory. And the thing about theory is that it builds on the experience of others. In every case, the processes and principles that we apply have been tested over and over again, and we know they work. And we have to be paying attention to the values that shape the process, particularly the idea of engagement. The things that Dick and Emily said, you know, those principles certainly apply. So the latest theory, what I'm seeing here around collaborative change. This photograph was taken last weekend. I did a board retreat for a nonprofit. And I've actually had the pleasure of actually doing a number of live events in the last 3 months for the first time in 2 years. And boy, people are longing for connection. It's like worth the price of admission just to be able to talk to each other. The clear message that I see, and it's not that this is nothing new, is that leadership is about helping co-create the future. And that means that it is not necessarily you coming down from the mountaintop with the stone tablets, for sure. One of the things that I found interesting was thinking about the difference between innovation and vision. I have always said, and I think we would always say that, you have to be motivated by an inspiring, compelling, energizing vision. But what if the world is too confused to know what your vision ought to be? And so sometimes we begin only with a purpose, knowing what our intention is, and we use innovation to help fashion how that will manifest itself. And so sometimes innovation comes before vision. Just kind of it was sort of a non-intuitive conclusion. I'm also noticing new cultures are emerging around diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And I've spent quite a bit of time teaching about team and team formation, and the elements of, and what Dick and Emily said about trust, have to do with how do you make people feel they belong? And there's a difference between belonging and fitting in. When you belong, it's safe to be yourself. When you're fitting in, you're adjusting your behavior so you're accepted by others. And finally, the latest thing that I see going on is that if there ever was a normal, there isn't one now, that we are in a constant state of transition. So my favorite story of collaboration, I did some guest lecturing for the Ross School of Business at the University of Michigan 2 years ago. And they asked me to take over a session to demonstrate the principles of whole-scale change. Well, I had 50 second-year MBA students. And so what we chose, and we used the classic whole-scale principles, including an event planning team. The idea was to create a vision of the future for the Ross School of Business. This was the agenda. We had 6 hours on a Saturday. This was compressing what might have been a 3-day meeting 20 years ago into 3 sessions of about an hour and a half or 2 hours each. And you can look at this and see, it'll follow, you'll see it's very familiar, the idea of discovery, dreaming, and designing being the theme of the 3 events. And what was so fun was watching these people who were mostly, these are people who came back for their MBA. They've worked, they're grown-ups, right? They've been out for 5 or 10 years and come back. They were very interested in looking at what should the Ross School look like in 2030. And what they came up with were suggestions, not surprisingly, around diversity, equity, and inclusion, but also around practicality, so just a whole bunch of really interesting issues. And the output, the professor said at the output, there are suggestions here that we should take to the dean. So there were things that actually came out of this experience that affected the real world. And I just, being able to do that, we did this virtually. We had just a wonderful time with, like I said, we had about 50 students, and they were totally immersed. And the thing that is so clear about this is that if you want this kind of a learning, any kind of whole system change endeavor, whatever you're doing in the meeting has to be relevant, and that means that it has to be associated with something that matters to these people. So my hopes for the future through collaboration. First of all, The median age in this group is over 75. And what I'm hoping is that the next generation will embrace this, pick it up and carry it on, just as we have carried on from people who came before us. My hope is that the challenges, the global challenges of COVID and climate change will force system thinking solutions, because there is no such thing as my problem or your problem. There's only our problem. Digital transformation will help to support the change, and Dick and Emily made a good point that digital is an accelerator and a way of increasing engagement and involvement. My hope is that somehow we figure out a way for democracy to survive because we learn to collaborate. And I'm speaking now to any students and other people, young people who are involved in this. I'm counting on you folks to make all of this happen. So if you wanted to, we could talk about the 7 models of whole-scale change, very similar to what Dick and Emily did. You can read about that. There are books about whole-scale change. You can read about that. Anybody who wants to contact me, I'm very open to doing informal consulting or mentoring with people who are interested in having more information. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
That's awesome. Thank you. For everybody that's gone so far, finger applause. Thank you so much, everybody. Good stuff. I love this. It's really, really good stuff. Thank you.
All right, Jim R. Yep.
Yes, that's me. Okay. Interesting, something Al said sparked for me, that democracy survives because we learn to collaborate. I really invented a process of facilitating called dynamic facilitation. And I didn't know that I was doing that. I just was working as a consultant in a timber company. And I was helping employees, but we didn't have the participation of management, or they didn't want to be involved. So I was interested in creativity. So I wanted to help these mill workers solve their problems in their environment. And so I wanted them to pick impossible to solve problems, the ones that, pick the problems they cared about most, the impossible seeming ones, and facilitate them to achieve breakthroughs. And to me, that's the core of collaboration, and the essence of it is the facilitative capability. So especially if people face an impossible seeming problem, you help them to rise to the occasion so that they can achieve miracles. And then they look at one another and they say, my God, how did we get these people together in a room? It just seems so neat. And even though in my mind, it's the process that's actually helping that to happen. And so when thinking about collaboration as a facilitative process, that opens the door to a new form of democracy. And so like this, it's really more of a facilitative function. So if we could set up a facilitator in the room, except have the room be the nation or the world, like how to get democracy to survive. If we could have that facilitative capability, then all of us as a people, we the people, could face these impossible seeming problems and rise to the occasion and create answers that we all are win-win answers that we all like, and that we got there through creativity, and then provide responsible leadership to the elected officials and to governments. And it's actually a new form of democracy. So it's like, of course, what we call now today democracy isn't really democracy. It's more of a constitutional republic. But real democracy would be that, very similar to what happened for the mill workers when they faced impossible seeming problems in their environment, like and achieve breakthroughs. And so that's been my focus, is how do we facilitate people to rise in their capability and to appreciate one another and to face the big issues and achieve shifts and breakthroughs. And in doing so, then it comes a new opportunity to appreciate differences among people. In other words, if you're going to be creative together, then you're being different than me is an asset rather than a liability, or you having a different view than I do, then now it's an asset rather than a liability. And when we overcome that to rise to a new level, then we look at one another in appreciation. And so we celebrate differences. And I don't know, I was trying to, so one piece, at least in the book, is dynamic facilitation is described in the book. That's what I call the process. And then the other piece is, how do we do that for very large systems? How do we do that for a nation or a city or the world? Because to me, that has to happen at a global level. So I don't see how our humanity survives without global collaboration, global, where all the people, and of course, if we had that, it means a transition, a transformation of our system. It means a transformation of reality. It means a transformation of human nature. It means, and I believe that all can be facilitated. And so I'm going to punch in an article that I just typed into the chat thing, an article that I published on that recently. So, but I'll stop there, except that the Wisdom Council process involves randomly selecting people from a very large system of people. So like for a city or for a nation or globally, and facilitating them in a way that they become a symbol of all of us, and they are facilitated to achieve breakthroughs and a unified voice. And then we have them walk on stage and share their story of what they got, the problem they faced and where they got to. And then the audience turns their chairs and they talk. And then it's a way that they can come to unity also. They can all say, yeah, why don't we do that? So one example, for instance, it's mostly been picked up in Austria and Germany, and it's been murder trying to get it to pick up here in the US, but Austria, Germany, Switzerland, any land that speaks German seems to be interested. I don't quite understand that, but so like, a good example I think is in Mauthausen, which is was a Nazi concentration camp during World War II, the largest one in Austria. Of course, now it's a bunch of buildings that it's really a tourist attraction. But the people of the towns, there were 3 towns right there, kind of don't know what to do with it. I mean, it's hard to have that be your tourist attraction. And so they did a wisdom council process where they, or at least they did, I guess, a wisdom council, a couple of them, I guess, where they randomly selected people from the local area. And they were dynamically facilitated to achieve some kind of unity about what we're going to do as a town, as a community around this, because the camps are kind of falling apart. Do you rebuild them? What do you do? And the conclusion that they reached, and I didn't do this, somebody else dynamically facilitated, but the conclusion that they reached is that we need to reframe how we think about this, that this really is an educational institution that we have here, and that we need to become a global learning center and we need to teach our youth. Our youth need to learn about the history and to become the teachers for what our tourists and for global conferences to happen there. So so anyway, it was I didn't get to be there, but I got to hear the story, and so it's really an exhilarating story. So a lot of the stories actually come out of Austria and Germany. Anyway, I'll just stop there and thank everybody for this opportunity. I love talking to you about it.
Thanks, Jim. A little bit of finger applause. Okay.
Thank you.
So yeah, thank you. James? You're on mute, James.
Thanks. It's Jim Haudan, and this has been a life calling for over 35 years, or about 35 years now. So, just a little background. We started a company in 1987 called Root Learning, which changed to Root Inc., which has been acquired by Accenture. It's still Root, a part of Accenture, but we have probably worked with over 80 to 90 million people around the world on change, and had a chance to work with over 850 companies in groups anywhere from 10 to 200,000. So I think, one of the things, in addition to read a couple of books, we have taken a lot of notes. And so I'm really intrigued by the title of this. And, the title of it is, latest thinking on collaborative change. And I think the first part of that thinking is that, there's an awakening that's going on right now. It's been called the Great Resignation. I think that's wrong. I think it's the Great Reassessment. And I think, when people begin to think about what they do and what they do at work, and you mention something like, on my deathbed, I was talking to somebody and they said, I wish I had one more day at the office. And people kind of laugh at that because you never hear that. But in fact, that's exactly what people are expecting today. They're expecting the same kind of fulfillment, the same kind of engagement, the same kind of sense of purpose, and the same kind of sense of joy and even love that they have in their personal lives is what they want in their organizational lives, where they spend 40 to 60% of their waking hours. And so they're reassessing that in droves. I'm not going to pay my dues. I'm not going to just go through the motions. I'm going to do something that creates one life for me, the same life I have in my personal environment and the one that I have in my work environment. And where that doesn't exist, I'm taking action. And so, and the stats are really sobering when you begin to look at it. The most recent stats that we've looked at is that 66% of people in the workplace don't feel valued. Over 50% believe that they contribute less than half of what they have to offer in the organization. So this whole concept of collaboration and change, I think, is coming to the forefront more than ever. And so the time and the timing is right. Some of the principles, though, that we've been, sort of taking notes on for a while seem to be in vogue finally, and more than ever, kind of the mainstay rather than sort of a unique little experiment in the corner. And I think the first and foremost, we've got a couple comments that we often use. And the first is, people don't resist change. They resist being changed by somebody else. And so if you're going to really engage people in change, and the collaborative change is the only kind of change, you have to do it so that you value their co-thinking. You engage them in the drama that what we're facing. You resist the concept that we're going to tell them what to think versus unleash what they have to think. I can't tell you how many times we've watched senior leaders being dumbfounded at the untapped intelligence of their people, because for years they told them about their job, never told them about their organization, their business, their direction, what they want to create. And when they do that, all of a sudden that higher expectation unleashes this torrent of fantastic ideas and curiosity and passion. So a couple of things that, we've said too, is that, people will tolerate the conclusions of their leaders, but they'll act on their own. I'm going to say that again, because it's, and all the people we've worked with, it's always been true. You can pep rally, you can cajole, you can encourage, you can somehow incent, you can do whatever the heck you want to try to get people to do something. But to really mobilize the hearts and minds of people, the only way to do that is to ask them to co-think what we're going to do, and to ask them to come to their own conclusions, and hope that those conclusions will stir new behaviors, because that's what change is all about. If you don't change your conclusions, you're not going to change your behaviors. And so people to be able to change their behaviors have to go on a journey to co-think that. And for most of what we've experienced over all the years, we have found a couple things to be true, and that is most often this happens when you have this mix of things that are really sort of the catalyst for this to occur. The first is small group. So, almost every time we've done anything powerful, we've found that it's small group. It's 6 to 8, 8 to 10 people. Once you get over 10, you're no longer having conversation, you're doing presentation. And I think, as Dave said earlier, there's absolutely nothing that'll happen in a presentation, because I've already said you'll tolerate the conclusions of leaders, but act on your own. It's only in conversation that you liberate people's ideas and imagination. As a matter of fact, we're kind of the opinion that dialogue is the oxygen of change. And interestingly enough, dialogus is the meaning comes out. Debate at the root cause is to beat down, and discussion is actually to heave one ideas at another. But dialogue is sort of that key. And for us, it's Socratic dialogue that really drives that. And so, if conversation is sort of this elixir that is really the oxygen of change, the second thing that we've said in small groups is the max mix, and somebody's already mentioned that. So, how do you get the max mix of people with backgrounds and experiences and different journeys? The third is Socratic dialogue, and the fourth is interesting because it is visualization. What we find is that the dialogue is spurred on by people to envision a system. And so, what you can't do is create a mental practice field or a brain gym if everybody's trying to conject what is going on in their minds. As a matter of fact, people have told us this on the front lines. When we go to the front lines and ask people whether it's a healthcare system or a, Harley Davidson, or whether it's Microsoft, and we ask about their leaders, they say, well, they're all screwed up. And we say, excuse me? And they say, well, they're idiots. And I say, okay, be more profound. They said, well, they're hypocritical. And we say, well, what do you mean? Well, it's as if we work around here, it's like working with a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. And, in 1 week they say cut costs, and the next week they say delight customers. 1 minute they say take risks. The next minute they say don't ever take a risk that puts us in danger. And they say, if it's a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle, why in the hell don't they ever send the cover of the box top across so we can see how it all fits together? And, and the fact of the matter is, if we don't appeal to that level of thinking and set the context correctly, people can't co-think what's really going on. One of the things that we've also found that this visualization has not only the ability to think in systems, but it has the ability, and I'm going to say this real slow because it's vital, to create psychological safety so people that are going to be involved in change can share in public vulnerability. And you say, well, what's all that about? Well, let me show you. We in a story that goes with this that is pretty fascinating. If I can make this work. So we're working with a large company, and it's in one of our books, so we can share it. It's Textron. So Textron doesn't make Dippy Dots, or Sunglass Hut. They are Cessna aircraft, Bell helicopter, E-Z-GO golf carts. So they're pretty serious businesses. And we had worked with their senior team for 6 months on their strategy. And then we had the top 250 people at a hotel in Florida to really mobilize them around being advocates for that strategy. And so after, 2.5 days at 11 o'clock, they were all going to go home. We put up this audience response system, and we asked them how confident they were on the strategy to advise their mom and dad, nephews, nieces, uncles, whatever, to buy the stock. And we went up on the screen with the results, and it ungodly said 19%. And the chairman looked at us and said, you guys are really good. How do we get all our money back? This is a disaster. If only 19% voted confidence with our top 250 people, and they were about a 63,000 person company, said, we don't have a snowball chance of hell of this thing working. So we said, hang on, let's go talk to your people and find out what's really going on. Now, this sort of ushered in one of the major critical elements of collaborative change, and that is truth-telling as a core competency. Transformation and change can occur much naturally if you have an honest assessment of where you are and a clear picture of where you want to go. Unfortunately, with the 850 companies we've worked with, we've never found one honest, and we've never found one clear, so you can't visualize fuzz. But when you work at it and really create the conditions to have an honest assessment and a clear picture, magic can happen. So in this case, what they told us was, if you see, all the leaders are wearing masks, not saying what they really think. The guy in the middle says, I met my number, you can't touch me, which means the change didn't apply to him. And the far right at the top are the kids at Thanksgiving at the kids' table. So they didn't even these businesses didn't even get to have the conversation were somehow isolated. They're drinking non-confrontational water. The real issues are undercover. You know, the half the group thought they'd be better off and the other apart. So this whole idea of coming together and doing something as one company, you know, was not being accepted. If you really wanted to do anything, as you can see on the far left bottom, you know, you put a little note in the inbox of the CEO and you had a private conversation on the balcony. I mean, you couldn't make this stuff up. Yet in the spirit of wanting to make change and involving their top 250 people and coming out with a new direction to create something new and exciting, their behaviors were absolutely inconsistent with that. And no one had ever called them out. So we showed this to the top 250 about 2 months later, and they said three things. They said, number one, we can't believe you had the courage to put the real issues on the table. And number two, we can't believe you knew what they were. If you're serious about making these changes, so are we. You know, Dilbert is probably one of the best change agents in the world. Because if you go around people's cubicles, all you see are these little cartoons about how people truly think and feel. And if you can't validate how people truly think and feel, we'll never engage them in going to risk to being part of change, collaborative or otherwise. And so this whole concept of shared vulnerability, about being open to the things that we are creatively dissatisfied with that are really contributing to what we are not happy about, is pivotal. You know, the way this process works, and we've now done it with hundreds of companies with amazing cartoons, where a humorist and a cartoonist can be more important to collaborative change than anything else, is that we ask what is relevant here. We have checks on this in terms of the ones that are holding us back. And then we ask a pivotal question. And that is, how have you contributed to this? From the CEO to the CFO to the COO, and all of them get to say, you know, I allowed that guy in the middle to do whatever he wants as long as he got his numbers, because I was afraid if we challenged him on change that we wouldn't get his numbers anymore. That's not going to work if we're going to value people across the board and come to a different place. And then one by one, people talk about that. The stock at the Textron went from 26 to 126 and split twice. Not that I'm a financial guy, but the chairman will tell you it wasn't their strategy. It was the day they decided to be publicly vulnerable with each other and talk about the issues they didn't know how to talk about that were clearly critical to their success in going forward. The second part of this that is intriguing in terms of visualization is one that I wanted to just show you, that is a story about Harley Davidson. And do this right, hopefully. Here we go. So this is interesting in one regard, because Harley Davidson, and this is all the economics of the business. You know, one of the things we found is that, you know, most organizations, when they tried to bring change to the organization, it was dead on arrival. And it was dead on arrival because the language of strategy was complex and elite, and only a few people understood it. And so how do you take, you know, business, and if you're a sports fan, make it as common as baseball? And so that everybody from the CEO to the newly hired janitor can participate in that conversation. And so this is an interesting conversation that we had with this organization, but, you know, they had a big challenge, and the big challenge is, you know, this is a business issue, but they had about $600 million caught up in working capital, which meant that all of the money that they wanted for new products and other things was tied up in the organization. We talked about, you know, where did money come from? Where did money go? You know, we talked about, you know, what was working capital, you know, what had to go to shareholders, you know, where does this system really start, and how does it continue? You know, everyone at Harley Davidson was involved in a 90-minute conversation of Socratic dialogue, not telling them what to think, but asking what they did think. And by the way, it's stunningly, in some cases, common in others, most people believe in our organizations we make 40 cents on the dollar. And so, but they really began to understand where this all, how this whole system worked. They had tried for 6 years to reduce working capital. 6 weeks after their people understood this as a system and how the system worked and what the inhibitors and chokeholds were this system, reduced it by $300 million. Now, again, this is an environment of workers on the front line that you would think on their different roles and responsibilities, wouldn't get it and wouldn't respond to it. They understood it completely, and they understood it like they never did before. And they had people constantly saying, why didn't you bring this to us before in this fashion where we could really understand how the lifeblood of the economic system of a manufacturing facility really worked? And we've probably done now 30,000 of these visuals on the marketplace, on strategy, on the economics. But the key is, and I think the essence of what I've heard from other people on our panel is that change is driven again by conversation, not presentation. And in many cases, conversation where we set the stage for people to begin to help us not only, understand, but more importantly, advocate and ultimately create. I think one of the fallacies of any change is that our people are not creators, they're implementers. And the minute you think about that, you devalue their ability to co-think what we really need to do and how we need to do it. The minute you see them as, again, in the spirit of servant leadership, someone that is closest to the customer, that if we could only unlock their intuition, their ingenuity, their ideas and their suggestions, and they help them implement those, we catch fire. And again, when it comes to collaborative change, I'll just repeat again, small groups of 8 to 10, max mix, Socratic dialogue, always. And you take a risk in that. What if they come to the wrong answer? And the answer is, what is the wrong answer in a world of constant change? Systems thinking through visualization. And again, this whole concept of how do we unleash our people to be part of something bigger than themselves, and in the way that we're trying to build a bright future for all of us. Probably the only other thing I would say is that through all of this, it is critical to recognize, even if we create safety, even if we create places where people are valued, and even if we create collaboration that is this robust give and take, which we often do in creating the visuals that you saw. Sometimes they're very iterative, and so that the visual iteration is this dialogue rich, making it together. If in any time or any place or any occasion, people believe that the need to change is an indictment of their past performance, they will stop. And so one of the things we really have to do is make people very aware of the fact that the need to change is not an indictment of our past performance, but in fact, everything we did to get us to this point should be celebrated. And we're often further than we've ever been, but not where we need to go and where we know we can go. And so how do we decouple this whole concept that somehow I might have done something wrong if we need to change as an individual, as we need to change as a team, as we need to change as an organization or a division? And, and I can't tell you, even with senior teams, you probably have to re-mention that 10 times, because the minute somebody thinks that we're now talking about something that I decided last Tuesday or last week or last month or last quarter or last year, and it's now being reassessed or rejudged, they will begin to defend and shut down and hold back. And so, I think all of this is interesting in one respect, and that is, if I could tell a story. We were working with the Bank of Montreal, and I'll never forget it because we had 3 of those, what we call learning maps. It was the big picture of the marketplace. It was the change in retail banking at the Bank of Montreal for the strategy. And then it was how they were going to do that, and how everybody participated in that. And there was a woman who had her head down, and towards the end of that 3rd learning map, which is 3 hours in, she said, this is the first time I've ever learned anything at this bank. And I said, excuse me? And she said, as if she was given permission now to share her soul, she said, this is the first time in the 14 years that I've been at this bank that I've ever learned anything. And I said, go real slow. My background, my bachelor's degree is in recreation, so I got to go slow. And she goes, well, learning requires thinking. And she said, for the last 14 years, everything I've been involved in was a one-way push or an attempt for the organization to persuade me what they think I should go do. And she said, what that meant was that I didn't have to think. I just have to either accept or tolerate what she was telling me. And she said, this is the first time that you asked me to co-think this business with you. She said, do you know the dignity that comes with that? Do you know that the sense of value that comes with the belief that you're going to take all this time to try to help me understand the business on the premise that I might be able to make it better than you could ever tell me again? She said, and as a result, in this last 2 hours, I've had underlying beliefs and assumptions about the way this business works that I have now changed just because I saw it in totality, or I saw it in connection with all the other things I never saw before. And she said, I've learned more in the last 3 hours than I've learned here in the last 14 years. And then she went on to elaborate how that made her feel, and what that caused her to be willing to take a look at and change, and the excitement that brought to her, literally her next day. And so, again, I think, one of the things that we often look at is how do you awaken the sleeping giant? The human potential in organizations that is sleepwalking through most of their days and not participating at the level that the great reassignment or the great resignation, which we call the great reassessment, I think is finally bringing to light. And that is, people are unwilling not to be part of anything where they can't bring their full self, all their ability to think, to innovate, to collaborate, to consider, to challenge, to stop doing is more important than start in many cases. And, the best definition I've ever heard of leadership is, what are you willing, what do you want to create that does not now exist, for which you're willing to endure personal sacrifice to bring to life? And I think most of the people are all in on that, but let's talk about what we want to create. But I'm not going to sit on the sidelines and watch that happen or be a bit player in that. I want to be fully engaged to make that happen.
Thank you. What a wonderful panel. And Jim, thank you for those remarks and thoughts to round us out. A lot to think about. We're going to go into breakout, and we're going to stay here with the panel. It's going to be recorded, so those of you that go, you'll be able to pop back in and look at the recording and hear what we talk about here. Have a conversation with a small group. We'll come back. We'll have plenty of time to all of us have a conversation. So that's the intention for the time that we built in, so that there's not a rush. I want us to take a breath into our belly, and a breath into reflection. So Lisa will send you off into small breakouts to have a conversation. We'll come back in about 15 minutes, and we'll all have a big group conversation. So what's another word for wow? What's another word for wow? What provoked me, Jim and all of you, what I've been sitting with, and I just got off a session with a very large engineering firm where I've been working on collaborative change principles within their top leadership, and I just finished the session. And wrestling with this idea of helping them see, Jim, when you were talking about, you said two things, and I was really interested how you addressed this. Like, okay, so you've got the picture that really helped that one organization see the issues that are under the thing, to see what's going on in the room. And people talk about how they're contributing to that. And then at the very end, I keep struggling with this large engineering firm, how to help them see what's not working, help them to see their role in it. And I'm trying not to shame them, right? I'm literally trying to figure out how to get them to say, maybe we can change things around here, because let me tell you, I'm watching, and I asked them off the cuff. I said, all right, so tell me how many hours a week you're in meetings. All right, a day. Then I said, I want you to multiply that times 5. And I said, you all are engineers, do the math for me. And I said, all right, now I want you to take that and I want you to tell me what percentage of your time each day is spent in your meeting. What percentage of your meetings are spent listening and be presented to or talked at? And they said 50%, right? And when they did the math, it came out to about 15 to 16 hours a week is spent in meetings being talked at or talking to. I said, do the math. How much do people cost and how many people do you have in your company? We figured out within like 5 minutes, it was over $100 million a year they spend in meetings being talked at or talking to. And so I struggle with, how do you help them become aware of that, be motivated to move off of that, but not feel defensive? That's a really tough challenge. That's a paradox that you've thrown out there, Jim. But you all have done this. So I'm curious, how do you do that? How do you all do that?
Yeah, I think there's two things just from my perspective. I think the whole panel probably has even better ideas, but the first thing we do is when we do the water cooler, by the way, we got that content from them. So, I mean, it's individually, they'll tell you what they think. They just won't do it collectively. They don't know how to do it collectively. So, we literally come up with true statements. And so when you look at that water cooler, most organizations, we come up with 8 to 10 true statements. And so my favorite was Pulte Homes, and they had a true statement that says, we do not probe the business for performance and don't know the difference between good and lucky in our 24 divisions. They went from last in their performance in their peer group to first on the S&P 500 2 years later. But there were 12 more true statements that I think they really had to go to. Taco Bell was a great one. It says, we claim we are customer maniacs, but in the end, we're finance maniacs that don't trust our people will do the right things for our customers if we took the controls off. They finally changed that, and the average restaurant went from 1.2 to $2 billion times 10,000. So I think, these true statements become really important. But I think that there's 2 other steps. The second step is, if the leaders are going to change, they've got to come up with new standards. And so the 3 places we come up with new standards, the first is, oh, by the way, I think there's a real important point here. If they don't agree on the realities that they need to address and have a shared view of that, you won't be successful, because everybody is addressing some other issue. And so until we agree these are the shared realities that are most inhibiting our success, or the culture we have, or whatever, good luck, because everybody walks around with a different picture in their head. But the standards we typically go after are, the first one is, underlying beliefs. What are the underlying beliefs, and how you want to run and grow this business? And that's a new standard coming out of those truths. The second is behaviors. We call them the behavioral ground rules. What are the behavioral ground rules you're going to use to lead this business and be the pace car for the organization? And then the third often that comes up is rules of the road, and the way we operate. And sometimes it's the operating model. It has a huge impact on culture. So what are the places where we've not been clear on how we want to operate? So that's one issue. I think the second issue, and this is a real tough one, Steve, that everybody wants to do this, but nobody does it. And so they're all very interested in it. And that is, when you talk about executive leadership, we see 5 hats, strategist, architect, which is around systems and capabilities, coach, which is around people, player, and other. And so when you look at that, the top 3 are on the business and the bottom 2 are in the business. And we still find that 80% of leaders' times at the very senior level are in the business on player and other, and 20% on the business, which is strategist, architect, and coach. And trying to get them to shift their time to that is a full-time job. But until they do, they won't change the business. They'll just run the existing business. And so both of those things, new standards that come off of the truths, and then, trying to get them to shift on versus in the business and where they spend their time, really are levers to try to really drive that change across their entire organization. And one last comment. And then the direct reports of the senior team become the same kind of group. So that's the 250 or the 50 or the 28 or 400, depending on the size of the business. that you have to take to the gym, just like you do the senior leaders. Because if you don't do that kind of work with them, they're just going to sit on the fence and wait to see what happens, when in fact they have to be the advocates for this.
Yeah.
Well, I liked hearing again and again the importance of the individual's behavior. While we're still talking collective, we're talking company, we're talking the globe. And so the keen focus that initially Peter Vail made on the question of what is practice and who is the practitioner is something I think that I'm re-invoking now at this point in our conversation, because Peter, who has spent his whole career thinking hard about organization change, came up with 32 conjectures on what one person means in an organization, and particularly means to themselves. That's the key. When I amplified Peter's work into the book, what I was saying over and over again in my amplification was, see how this feels to you. See how this conjecture touches you. What does this mean to you? In other words, to see an individual practitioner in all of its potential complexity is so important to our field. We've got to stop thinking of them as a role, a number, a seat filler, someone at the bench, someone on the road driving. And any one of these people, when you talk to them and listen to them, they're wonderfully complex. They're tremendously creative. We've heard this all through this conversation today, and they're so thrilled to be asked. One last thing I'll say. When Peter could no longer be with me on the podcast, he passed away in March of 2020, and most likely from COVID, I decided to keep it going, because one thing that thrilled Peter was when we bring in a third party for the conversation, and you could just hear him in his last stage of life lighting up when he heard someone talk about what they do and how they do it. What they do and how they do it, and then what it means to them. So since then, I've had another 100+ people in conversation recorded for the podcast. Every one of them, when you ask them, what are you doing now? How do you do it? What do you feel about it? In so many words, you could not contain the energy. The one I just posted today, I said, I know you're an IT person at a company, but Peter said that one of the greatest practices we can look at is being a mother. And I said, we'll talk a little bit about being a mother. It's a Chinese woman who's moved here and has become a citizen, has 2 little girls under 2.5. When you hear her talking about what it is to be a mother, I wanted to run somewhere where I could say, Mom, thank you. So that's the yin and the yang of all this. While we're talking collective, we're talking even small group, also recognize that each person is enormously complex. And so what? If it is, that's great. That's wonderful. So soapbox, I'm taking the soapbox, I'm putting it aside. Let's talk.
The other one thing I want to kind of support and emphasize is that these seniors groups don't have their act together in the sense of going into a collaborative space. So I think they're in some ways bound by the notion we know how to do this when they don't know how to do this.
They're probably terrified too.
Yeah, and and it's like, okay, you bring all these people together, and what if they come up with a different answer? And so part of it, I think the work is, and I thought it was shown so well in James's map, is bringing that sense of safety to where they can begin to talk about their fears, their concerns, what's not true within their own smaller group, as they begin to work with the larger group. Because I think providing that support where they can have those kinds of honest conversations, like, I'm going to be in this small group and I'm terrified about being in it, because what if I say the wrong thing? Or what if people take what I say out of context and it becomes the next, oh, we have to do it this way. So where they can begin to have those kinds of conversations, to me, then opens them up to be able to have the conversations with that next group of 250 or whatever, whatever it happens to be. So providing, I think, the support and atmosphere, facilitation that allows those conversations to occur, I think becomes really important.
Definitely. But look, I mean, I did a little bit of organization consulting over my career. Mainly, I was in the classroom, and I think of you folks who are doing this work. I think of Al and everyone who spoke today, and I think, wow, talk about courage. Jesus, to paid or not, to step into that someone's orbit with all that stuff flying around, some of it hitting a fan and all the rest, and then talk to a group of senior leaders in such a way you calm them and help them feel encouraged that they can make change. That's amazing work.
Yeah, thank you.
And I know that doctoral programs like Steve's and masters that they're out there are trying to help people do that. But wow, once you're in the field, there's got to be some times when you come out looking for Band-Aids and mercurochrome. I mean, geez. And I think the point was made, and I think it might have been Jim was not here, the other Jim, was that facilitation is the work. And it's amazing work. It's difficult, challenging work, because you can't own the results. They have to own them, and you can't tell them what to do. So you're floating there like some kind of white bird of hope or dove of hope or something in the midst of all this. So that's just my impression. It's an amazing practice, and thank God for it.
And one thing,
I got more.
Go ahead, Dick.
I got more courage as we got more established, but I would say to myself, what's the worst thing they can do? Fire me?
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
But it took a while to get there, because you have to be able to be sure you're putting food on the table as well.
Yeah. My students would say, have a side hustle.
I was working with our local mayor, Mike Bell, many years ago, and I learned a lesson that I'll never forget. I've been working with him, and that is, as he comes from a command and control structure. He was in fire and rescue, so he would always come up to me and say, "Steve, what do you need to happen? Just tell me." He'd come up to me and I'd say, "I'll work it." Well, that's okay, I'll work it. But one thing I didn't do is when I was working with the people that were around him, I was seeing a group of people that really weren't committed to engaging the city and the region, and they would oftentimes just go through the motions. And I remember the pastor of a major church, Cedar Creek Church. He was at an event, and we had him in breakout rooms to talk about different initiatives. And he came out and he said, I have a kind of an issue with what's going on. He said, the person that he's got on his team is in the room helping to champion this particular area. And he says, I'm only here because I have to be here to talk with you all. And I never really said anything. I never spoke my truth into the thing. I said, from now on, I'll never hold back and not speak the truth that I'm seeing and not say that. If whatever it means, I'm going to have to speak the truth. But one thing that I'm curious about with you all is you all have such good insight. I'm like just always like taking notes and like listening. Man, this is. Is there a question you don't have an answer to?
Yeah, lots of them.
I'm curious. What's like? I don't mean it in like you have an answer for every question, but I'm curious. What is your question that you really still are wrestling with that maybe you don't have an answer to right now? Because there's so much that what's on your edge?
I think one of the issues that those of us who've been around the block a few times is this dynamic between knowing what the leader ought to be doing and letting them discover it for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And that asking questions, this is where James was talking about Socratic dialogue. It says, this for these leaders, this is, I think, one of the things that I struggle with is that I truly believe that you cannot work for somebody if you don't love them at some level. If you think this is the stupidest, most incompetent jerk I've ever run into, you're not going to serve that person well. You have to be able to accept the fact that they're not perfect. And the question, and so I sometimes, will say to the leader, what do you think they're expecting of you? And how can you, this is about co-creating the future, right? The greatest gift that a leader can give to the people is to say, I don't know. Let's figure it out. Because that's the kind of vulnerability that leads to building trust. And that's, I've been really focused on the concept of team dynamics, but not just in terms of intact teams, but in the way in which people relate to each other. And so even if it's two people relating to each other, or it's a small group or whatever it is, or it's a table of a breakout room of 8, whatever it is, the beginning place is that everybody needs to feel like they belong, they deserve to be there, and that they're accepted for who they are. But secondly, there needs to be clear expectations about how we're going to work together, roles, responsibilities, and there have to be clear outcomes with metrics. And so in those, what we call membership control and goals issues, are the ones that will cement a relationship or destroy a relationship. And as James said, if you don't have truth, you won't have trust. So the question is always to say, as an observer, as a person who's seen this movie before, how do you create the conditions where people can discover their own right answers? Because Steve, you're right. People are going to say, you're the consultant, what should we do? Well, they've mistaken an expert, a subject matter expert, for a process consultant. Because what we're about here is creating conditions where the right answers will emerge collectively.
I think that's excellent. And I think if I could just share one thing too, Steve, to your point, this chart is, so what do we don't have answers for? I think we've got great answers in my view on how to initiate it. And but there's these dark days, after the brass bands and dancing bears and everybody's in favor of it, and then the near-term pressures, the results aren't visible. Do we really need this? And the dark nights, I've often heard that if we know 5 languages and we hit our thumb with a hammer, we cuss in our native language, so we go back. And so the real question here is, before you get above this line again, how in the world, what are the systems we can put in place? What are the ways that we can help people continue to change their behaviors in this process when every force around them is suggesting, go back, go back, go back. And so that's the one I don't know that we figured out. I think we've tried systems and processes to make change almost like self-regulating, so people know how to change before someone has to really help them do it. How do you become almost, like, I forget the fancy word, but it has to do with, self-monitoring to know it's time for me to change. And there are ways to do that, and there are different platforms, and there's a bunch of companies that'll, send you something every morning and every night. And but I think we're still trying to figure out, how do people successfully ride the waves of change and make the waves of change versus getting swamped by them, and especially when it's it's not clear that the results are right in front of you. I mean, there's a point here where you just have to believe, and so how do people get through that? I mean, I think that's constantly been our challenge. But the front part of it, where people are going to change behaviors and start to do all that and really value, I think we can get all that done. But when it gets dark, how do we make sure that they stay true to what's possible together that wasn't possible when they were apart?
Maybe it's Viktor Frankl's work, that book, Man's Search for Meaning.
Yeah, it's the one book when somebody, they asked you at a dinner party, what's the one book you would advise anyone to read. I mean, there's no question that's my go-to.
Yeah, it's crazy how powerful his work was.
Yeah.
And just for those of you that may not have be aware of it, at the core of it, he was curious why people in the camps, the Nazi war camps, he's a medical doctor, he's curious why people were dying, particularly those that were healthy, while people that were not healthy were surviving and living. And he was trying to figure out what was the difference between the two groups, and he said the one telltale sign that people were going to die was they started giving away their cigarettes, which was the currency in the camp. And talking with people, and from a qualitative analysis perspective, and just listening to their stories and the patterns in their stories, the ones that were surviving said that they had something to live for, something to go back for, something. They had a project to finish. They had family to see. They had someone to care, something. They had something that they had to go back to, and it was really, and that gave them the resilience to make it through those dark times, you know. And maybe that's what it's about. Maybe at the core, it's just like it's simple, but it's really hard.
We have a current example of several million people, more than several million people living in Ukraine, who have made a choice to stay and defend and make sure that everyone knows that the country matters to them, that they don't want to be taken over by another regime, and giving their life to it. So in some ways, we're back to Viktor Frankl again. I'm sure it's not everyone, but it's enough so far. And I wish some of us in this country could feel what they feel about their country right now, that they're willing to, they see that even though, if you look at all the rubble, and it stuns me, every morning I see whole cities just look like moonscapes. It's horrible. And I see people thinking, yeah, I'm coming back to that. The mothers and kids who are in other parts, no, we're coming back. There's going to be something there that we can live in. So very interesting times for us to be in this work, isn't it?
Yeah.
If I pick up on your point, Dave, the Ukraine has been on, I think, all our minds. And I've been looking at it as a possible intervention in global affairs where those of us who are neither Putin nor Ukrainian are finding something to live for that's larger than what we were looking for, just a little while ago. That's what I'm hoping. That might be hopeful, but that's on the upside of what's going on there. That there could be a convening, and those of us that are at all connected to that might be able to help facilitate that connecting among the NATO people and some of the non-NATO groups, but to pull together to take advantage of this awful situation.
Yeah.
And anyway, that's one of the big interests I have is what do we do when we have, and I have some local people that I call local Putins, but what do we do with a world that has those people as well as us collaborators? And that's one kind of intervention I think of as say, what can pull the larger systems of people together.
Yeah, we've gone through the double whammy, haven't we? We on the screen survived COVID so far, and largely because it took collective action to create the virus, the vaccines and all the rest, and get it delivered. I mean, someday historians will step back and just look at that alone as amazing that you got shots into all those arms, and that some people didn't want them, refused them, but most people took them. So that in itself, we're alive. I mentioned Peter earlier. I think he was one of the first ones to succumb to that virus. So we're alive. So that's the first one. And now, yay, we're alive, and yay, we're able to come back and meet in person. And oh no, the world's experiencing hopefully the small war that hopefully won't lead to the big one. So if we have nothing to talk about with each other now at the corner down at the coffee shop that's positive, we better start talking positive. and democracy in particular.
Yeah, I'm Rebecca. For some reason, I want to ask you, what are you reflecting on? And just, I'm curious.
You called on me, Rebecca?
Yeah, what are you reflecting on as you're listening? What's happening for you?
Well, I only got to catch James's piece, but in my breakout, for me, I was thinking about, I like the reframing and the opportunity to kind of, take notes and give us the chance to think about visualization and what happens when people get to see the big picture. It's kind of concepts that, and dialogue, right? So we're now into the territory of thinking about meaning, and Dave is pondering Ukraine and Putin, and I think that at any level, whether we're looking at a manager and a team, or we're looking at a global totalitarian situation, authoritarian situation, the opportunity for people to dialogue, like what could have happened if we'd found ways for better dialogue before we got to this war. What mechanisms do we have for creating, whether there's a possibility of rational discourse. So all of this is kind of just mushing around my brain and like, how do we do this at any of these levels? So I really appreciate getting to hear James and kind of igniting new ways to think about that. And I know we've never met before, Steve, so thanks for calling me out.
Yeah, it's nice to meet you. Yeah, and I was what would you all advise Finland to do?
Say that again.
As who?
What would you all advise Finland to do?
Join NATO.
Remember 1940.
Oh, Phil.
Or Norland?
That,
Yeah.
yeah, at some point you can't be bullied by somebody. The whole reason we kept out of a Third World War was we had 25 times the weapons to blow up the entire earth, and everybody knew it. And for us not to take a real firm stand and say, we're going to call your bluff, to me is simply a mistake, because he's going to take a guy like Putin with a narcissistic personality disorder is going to take advantage of every opportunity. And at some point you got to say, I've got to gamble on the Third World War, and I got to gamble on enough of the generals being sane that they're going to take out Putin. I went to the military academy. I don't mean to get all the military strategy and everything, but there's a point, there's a reason we stayed out of the mutual assured destruction, kept us out of war. Finland is kind of the canary in the coal mine in a sense, now to say, okay, what happens next? And I think that they should absolutely join NATO as fast as humanly possible and see what, if Putin is, basically call his bluff.
I want to jump in and say that was a great question, Steve, because after the conversation I heard this morning, I wouldn't want to advise Finland at all. But having been in Finland a few years ago, one of the things that struck me about the culture I was encountering there, they didn't want to tell me. They were just reticent. And so I had to listen much better than I'm used to listening to be able to learn anything from them, because what they were teaching me is, no, don't blurt. They didn't say don't be American. They didn't say anything, and I had to learn from that. But I think of, what I want to do with Finland is probably see what I can learn from them. I just blurted that.
I think a couple of things that come up for me in the time that we've had together here, when I think about collaboration, and I was sharing this in my small group, two words I think are particularly important for me. One is transformation and the other is synergy. And I think it's more than just finding common ground and finding solutions where everyone sort of has contributed and feels that they own a part of it, but it's going beyond translation. It's going beyond problem solving. It's going to a place where we can transcend and include some differences. And I think dialogue is an effective way to do that. I'm speaking of dialogue in the David Bohm sense, where we co-create new meaning together. And I think as a species, we're dealing with issues and complexities at a global scale that's going to require that level of thinking and that level of communicating in order for emergence to happen. And I think that's what we're looking for. We're looking for something to emerge out of this that none of us can clearly see yet, but we're all hoping and moving with our interest and energy to achieve that.
Have we created, in at least in our country, a system of schooling, K-12, in recent years, preparing these kids for coming out and being meaning makers, maybe already meaning makers? I received graduating high school seniors into my management classes at the regional university. And over time, I saw more and more closed, more and more check the box, more and more fill in the blanks. And I'm a liberally educated person, so it was quite a clash to see how narrowed and how timid generally students had become through this No Child Left Behind, all the massive testing programs. And then I saw it happen to my own field, business schools. When we wanted to be accredited, we had to give up an awful lot of ways, creative ways that we were doing our teaching and our research in order to fit ourselves into the box that was created by those standards. So I'm just throwing in here that why I totally agree that meaning making of a kind for transcendence is crucial. I'm looking at the stock and millions of exceptions of really bright kids who can survive any kind of bad schooling. But it's something we need to tackle as a nation, I think. And we have teachers quitting now because they're not allowed to teach. They're only allowed to instruct. I keep throwing these wet blankets out here, Steve. I'm awful about it, but I think we have some lovely models and great tools and everything else we can do about it. We got to look at context. World wars, world pandemic, and schooling that is becoming more restrictive instead of the opposite. And at the same time, our voting systems and other things are under assault. Yeah.
One of the things that I've been doing recent research on and learning around is the neuroscience and making some connections between the neuroscience of learning and some of the industrialization and scientific management that's been occurring over the last 300 years, and we're kind of moving out of it. But there's new research that's coming out that around the concept of the pre-neural network. And the pre-neural network is like what clamps down the neurons in the brain in learning. And there's 2 times when the clamps come off, and then the network can flourish, grow, and reduce white space in the brain, and actually grow the brain. They're finding they're verifying it in rats, and they really are still trying to they haven't gotten into human research. And one is in 0 to 7. You all know that from the emotional intelligence and a lot of the stuff that talks around that. But the second time that it happens is in puberty, that they're finding that during puberty, that the chemicals that are coursing through the body and brain are causing these clamps to come off. But then, and there's this notion of atrophy of the brain. And they talk about atrophy and plasticity. And if you think about it, this idea that you check your brain at the door worked for 200 years really well for us.
Yeah.
Because we needed to train people in schools to go into factories and go into very rote environments and do work and not ask questions and not learn and not, and challenge and not do that. And so we've created a whole world where we're doing that. And now it's beginning to shift, right? Because what happens is when that prefrontal cortex starts getting engaged, it's painful. And that pain of having to use it and to soften up the brain as an adult is really hard.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the challenge in terms of what Jim was showing, that piece where you go down into the dark area, helping people stick with it long enough not to go back, but to
Yeah.
move through it. We're actually trying to help them as adults, you all of us, learn how do we get our brain to be plastic again, or to be agile and to be nimble and to be growing and to be, kind of clay-like. And I think we're moving into a whole new era. And we for almost 300 years, scientific management's been telling us to really teach people not to use their brain.
Steve, you asked earlier about questions we didn't have answers to, and what you triggered for me is that a lot of us here did a lot of work in factories. And at the time that we were doing that work, people didn't expect much. Okay. I didn't expect to use my brain. I didn't expect much out of work. Okay. And life occurred outside of the factory. And one of the concerns that I've had for a long time is that we've created really interesting work. Okay. In a sense that the work becomes addictive because it's so engaging for many people. And I think there's a cost to that, okay? That you can't always be engaged, and you can't, in the sort of high that comes from that as you learn and grow and develop. And so I'm just wondering if there's a swing back or something, or part of the the Great Resignation was to have, what I was hearing was, we want to have more of that sort of self-actualization and expect that to occur at work. So there's something there that I don't quite have a handle on. Okay, as we look at the arc of work and the meaning of work in people's lives.
Yeah. And it's interesting. Jim, you said something, and I can tell you're getting ready to say something. I just want to ask you real quick. You talked about the notion of change happening to me, change happening. Did you say by me? What was the second piece? It's to me, by me. What were you saying?
I'm not sure exactly what you're referencing, but to me, was it in the, where was it, Steve, when we were
I
talking?
can't remember, but essentially, I think it was like people say that like change is happening to me, right? People look at change.
Being done
What are
to
you
me.
doing?
Yeah.
What are you doing to me versus what am I doing? I've just started thinking lately about this notion that helping people understand what's happening within me. And what happens is I think people if we can help people understand that change is not happening to me, but it's happening within me.
Yeah.
And as I'm going through an experience, I'm learning, my brain is getting challenged. It hurts a little bit. It's uncomfortable. My first reaction is to externalize responsibility and to try to say, look at what you're doing to me, because it's an attributional bias. I'm instantly blaming others for what's happening. So I'm looking at what's happening to me, and I try to get people to say, well, what if this is not happening to you, but it's a good thing. What you're experiencing is necessary. You're actually becoming a more whole person. It's not comfortable. Neither is working out, and neither is eating healthy sometimes, right? But something's happening within you, and it's good.
Yeah, no, there's a couple thoughts that really, I'll try to go quick, but one thought
We got time.
is that there was a guy many years ago, Larry Miller, and he started out working in prisons, and so when he went to prisons, he would ask the first guy how you got there. And he says, the craziest thing, my friends wanted me to drink a beer with them. The next thing I know, they robbed the carryout and we get caught by the cops. And it wasn't me, it was the other guy. And he said, I went to the second prison and I asked the guy how he got there. And he said, well, I look just like my cousin. It wasn't me, it was the other guy. He goes, I didn't find a single cell that was occupied with somebody that wasn't there because of the other guy. And then he said, I started working with corporate America or organizations. And he said, I'd go to marketing and say, how come we're not ascending to the level we're capable of? He goes, well, you wouldn't believe how screwed up operations is. It's the other guy. He goes, I found this other guy in every organization I worked with. And I became convinced that if I captured them, we would solve our prisons and our organizational problems, and I think what tends to happen is that there's 3 buckets. The first bucket is within my control. The second bucket is within my control with help. And the third bucket is outside my control. And people just have this tendency to put almost 80 to 85% of it in that third bucket. This really is outside my control. Or somebody else needs to be accountable. They're not being accountable. I mean, I can't tell you how many organizations we go in and this issue of accountability comes up. And what that means is somebody else ought to do something because they're not doing it. But when people get a chance to sort of step back and listen and look, they almost move the 85% to the other 2 buckets. And so, but that you have to process that, because the first reaction is something is happening to me that I have no control over, but upon reflection, they change their mind. Now, I think, this whole issue of school, hopefully this doesn't offend anybody, but one quote I heard that I've always loved as a former educator was, teaching is to learning as a tour guide is to adventure. And so, this whole concept of what does it look like when people are really on an adventure. And I think in organizations, we found a little bit of light at the end of this tunnel. And it's framework and freedom. It's a paradox. So you got to get people to think about this. There are some places where human variability is what we're trying to eliminate, clearly as on food safety, clearly on health protocols in health systems, clearly on, aeronautics in terms of, there is one way, this is the way we're doing it. Don't vary from that, don't deviate, whatever. That's the framework. We're going to all do it this way. And then there's the other place where freedom, where if we don't have human variability, we won't have exceptional or excellent or high performance. We just won't. It's only because of human variability. What happens is in our organizations, we can't think paradoxically. We can't think about the and, we think of the or, and so what we found is that, and this is a simple way to do it, in organizations, how do we help people think about hard lines, guidelines, and no lines? So there are hard lines where the framework is going to be unrelenting. This is the way it's going to be. And then there's guidelines where between these boundaries, you've got a lot to do. And then there's no lines. And if this is where, we need you to come up with whatever that idea is. We had a wonderful example of this at Hilton, and I could give you the example on hard lines and guidelines, but when it came to no lines, whenever you get, use your skills to best, introduce and experience the guest. If you're a comedian, tell jokes. If you're somebody that's great on instructions, tell them where to go. If you're, whatever it is, use your strengths or whatever it looks like, but make it unique, make it special, make it exceptional, but it's up to you, and it's phenomenal how that worked, when people really get this idea that there are hard lines, guidelines, and no lines, and we're going to have this paradox of exactly what we tell you, exactly how you want to do it, open your brain, and we're going to pour it in, and that's what you got. And then there's these variations to that where we want this too, and we want this in all the technicolor you can bring to the table.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Works and work.
I love that. And Jim, I love that the framework. I use it all the time. As Lisa, who is in my class, I always quote you in the firm lines, guidelines, no lines, and I share that a lot. So we are getting close to wrapping up. That's only for today. Like I said, this is my life's work is bringing you all together and helping us connect more and more people in the conversation that do this work in ways that we can make it more of a standard way of work in the world, and way in which we transform and revitalize and just develop. And so I'm super grateful. I'd be curious in the chat, if you don't mind, what's the one thing that you took away from today? If you could just, what's a nugget today that you say, yeah, maybe something that you were reminded of, maybe something that's brand new, maybe a resource. What's something that you took away from today? It'll help me have a sense, and help us have a sense of where we are. If you could share that. And in wrapping up, what we'll do is we will have all of these. You will all who are here will get the recording. It's a part of a vlog, as well as a podcast on Spotify, all things change. And you'll be getting a link to all the recordings from the previous ones, as well as I have a whole bunch that we're putting up from the last several years. And so you'll have access to all that. And we have some great thoughts. More programming will be done. and you're going to get invited. We'll have deeper dives, and I'll be jumping in with each of you in many ways and for deeper dive sessions and things like that. And the conversation will continue. So anybody want to give some open reflection as we say goodbye? Any takeaways you want to share out publicly?
I'd like to say really quick, I haven't spoken, I've been listening. My name is Meg, and I just want to say I've taken in a lot. I didn't get to really talk about what I do, but I'm in education and created a system over the last decade doing research in the schools, a system that you're talking about, a teaching, learning, and coaching system to support a new way of education. And I just feel like I'm with my group. Carol Gorelick and David Isaacs told me about you guys, and I got it in my inbox today, and everything in me said, you got to go today. It's time. So I'm happy to be here. I look forward to being a part of it, whatever it is, to continue learning and growing. But thank you. I learned a lot today.
Meg, I'm in Asheville as well, so look me up.
Oh, okay, Terry.
Well, send a little chat note. Send a chat note.
Yep.
Make sure you go
Something
ask
about that town.
I spent a good part of my life in Wolf Laurel, so I love that.
Yeah. David Isaacs lives here too. I don't know if you know him too.
Mhm. Any other closing reflections or appreciations as we wrap up?
One of my colleagues like to say, none of us is as smart as all of us.
Yeah, that's true. Well, since this is the last session of all 5 you've done, Steve, or 6, I've lost count. Wow. Wow to you, to Lisa, to Theo and others who work behind the scene, and particularly to your students who one way or another are going to be part of this and they'll see the review. But this is an extraordinary moment that you've created. So thank you.
Okay. Have a great day. I'm very grateful.
Thank you.
Bye for now.
Wiggle, wiggle.
I think the thing on democracy is that